the library that was never burned. You have been told your whole life that Julius Caesar burned down the greatest library in human history. One fire, one night, one accident, and 700,000 scrolls turned to ash. It is one of the most repeated tragedies in the ancient world, the moment humanity lost its past. The story is clean. It is dramatic. It has a villain, a date, and a conclusion. There's only one problem. It never happened that way. And the people who built the lie knew exactly what they were doing. The Library of Alexandria was not a single building. It was an institution, a living organism of knowledge with acquisition agents stationed in every major port in the Mediterranean, a staff of hundreds of resident scholars, and satellite repositories scattered across the city. At its height, it held somewhere between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, according to ancient sources including the letter of Aristeas and administrative records attributed to Eratosthenes himself. It was the most complex intellectual infrastructure the ancient world had ever assembled, and we are supposed to believe it vanished in a single night because a general knocked over a torch. Here is what the timeline actually shows. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 before the Common Era, which Caesar documented in his own writings, burned warehouses near the harbor containing scrolls that had been cataloged for export. Not the Bruchaion library itself. The ancient sources are inconsistent on this point, and the most damning evidence against the single fire story comes from a man who visited Alexandria a generation after Caesar. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing around 20 before the Common Era, described the Mouseion as fully operational, its scholars in residence, its collections intact. You cannot burn 700,000 scrolls and then have a functioning library decades later. The math does not work, yet Plutarch, writing 150 years after Caesar, is the first source to claim that Caesar destroyed the Great Library. 150 years. That is like a historian today writing an eyewitness account of something that happened in the 1800s. The classical scholar Roger Bagnall, in a 2002 paper in the American Journal of Philology, argued that the library most likely declined through funding cuts, political instability, and systematic looting across centuries, not through any single catastrophic event. Because there were other fires, there were other destroyers. Emperor Aurelian crushed the Bruchaion quarter of Alexandria entirely in 270 of the Common Era during his military campaign to retake Egypt from the Palmyrene Empire. That event, documented by ancient historians, is arguably the most significant physical destruction the library complex ever suffered. Then in 391, Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria led a Christian mob that dismantled the Serapeum, a confirmed secondary library site, an event recorded by the ecclesiastical historian Socrates Scholasticus. Then in 641, the Arab general Amr ibn al-As reportedly informed Caliph Omar of the library's remaining holdings, and the Caliph allegedly responded that if the books agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. That quote appears only in sources written 500 years after the fact and is almost certainly a later fabrication. But it completed the story perfectly for whoever needed it completed. Every major conqueror of Alexandria has a version of this story attached to them. Caesar, Aurelian, Theophilus, Omar. Each regime that followed needed a clean break from what came before. A library full of records is a threat to anyone rewriting history. So the story was told and retold, simplified with each telling until the 700 years of gradual, deliberate, politically motivated destruction became a single night of Roman carelessness. The accident is the cover. The accident lets everyone off the hook. And Mark Antony, according to Plutarch's own account, gave Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls from the Pergamon library to replenish Alexandrian holdings. You do not replenish a collection that was destroyed 16 years earlier. You replenish one that was damaged, one that was still alive, still being used, still worth fighting over. Some researchers ask whether any of those scrolls survived, whether Vatican archives, private collections, or monastery libraries in the deserts of Egypt contain fragments of what was methodically removed before each wave of destruction. We may never know, but we should at least be honest about what was lost and how. The story of one fire on one night is itself one of history's most elegant lies. It buries 7 centuries of evidence under a single dramatic moment, and it asks you to stop asking questions because the story is already over. It is not over, and from the erasure of knowledge, we move to something even more fundamental. The erasure of the gods themselves, or rather, the discovery that the gods were always the same God, told by different people for the same reason. The gods who were all born the same way. Before Jesus was born of a virgin in Bethlehem, the Egyptian god Horus was born of the virgin Isis in the Nile Delta. Before that, the Persian deity Mithra emerged into the world on the 25th of December, surrounded by shepherds who brought offerings. Before that, the Hindu god Krishna was born of the virgin Devaki in a miraculous conception announced by celestial signs, while a ruling king ordered the slaughter of infants to prevent the child from growing to power. These are not footnotes in comparative religion textbooks. These are the foundational narratives of civilizations separated by oceans, centuries, and entirely different languages. And they are telling the same story. The specific cluster of elements is what makes this impossible to dismiss as coincidence. It is not just the virgin birth. It is the full sequence. A divine father, a miraculous conception, a celestial announcement at the moment of birth, a humble location despite royal destiny, visitors bearing gifts from distant lands, a ruling authority who perceives the child as a threat and moves to destroy it, wisdom displayed in youth that confounds the established religious order, a sacrificial death, a resurrection after a specific interval. This checklist appears across Horus, Mithra, Dionysus, Attis, and Krishna with a structural consistency that has occupied comparative religion scholars for over a century and produced some of the most contentious debates in academic history. The Egyptian texts give us the oldest version. The contendings of Horus and Seth, dated to approximately 1150 years before the Common Era, describes Horus born to Isis through a supernatural act after the death of Osiris, his divine father. The parallels in the Mithraic tradition are more contested. Franz Kuhmann's landmark study, The Mysteries of Mithra, published in 1903, documented the Roman cult's ceremonies, which included a ritual meal of bread and wine representing the body and blood of the god, and a resurrection narrative central to initiation rites. The specific claim that Mithra was born of a virgin on December 25th is disputed by some scholars who argue these details were later additions or misinterpretations. That dispute itself is telling. Somebody has always been very invested in keeping these parallels from looking too clean. Krishna's birth narrative in the Bhagavata Purana draws from oral traditions reaching back at least to 400 years before the Common Era. His mother Devaki receives a miraculous divine visitation. His birth is heralded by celestial phenomena. King Kamsa orders the massacre of all male infants born in the region. The structural match to the Herodian massacre of the innocents in the New Testament account is exact, right down to the royal paranoia and the divine child who escapes the slaughter. Dionysus, the Greek god of transformation and ecstasy, was born of the mortal Semele impregnated by Zeus without physical union. His worshippers consume bread and wine representing his body and blood in ritual ceremonies that Euripides documented in the Bacchae in 405 before the Common Era. Attis, the Phrygian god, died and was resurrected with his celebration falling on March 25th, 3 days after his death on March 22nd, according to Pausanias writing in the 2nd century of the Common Era. The historian and New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman in Did Jesus Exist?, published in 2012, makes the strongest mainstream counter-argument. He contends that the parallels have been overstated, that the Greek concept of divine parentage is not equivalent to the Hebrew concept of virgin birth, and that resurrection myths carry fundamentally different theological meanings in different traditions. He is not wrong that the parallels have sometimes been exaggerated by popular authors, but the pattern remains when you strip away the exaggerations. The specific narrative architecture, the sequence of events, the symbolic functions of each element recurs with a consistency that demands explanation. And then there is the Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era, convened by the Emperor Constantine, which standardized Christian doctrine from among dozens of competing texts. The Nag Hammadi Library, discovered in Egypt in 1945 and containing 13 codices of alternative gospels dated to the 2nd century of the Common Era, presents a Christ whose story in some texts is radically different from the canonical version. Those texts were buried in a sealed jar in the Egyptian desert, apparently around 390 of the Common Era, around the time Bishop Theophilus was dismantling the Serapeum. Someone buried them to save them from what was coming. The mainstream response is that humans independently gravitate toward similar mythological archetypes because birth, death, and renewal are universal experiences. Joseph Campbell spent his career arguing precisely this, and there is genuine explanatory power in that framework. But it does not explain the December 25th date. It does not explain the 3-day resurrection interval. It does not explain why the ruling authority always fears the divine child and orders a massacre of innocents. Archetypes explain broad shapes. They do not explain specific coordinates. What if the virgin birth story is not evidence of divine truth, but evidence of the world's most successful political software? A narrative operating system that every state religion installed because it worked. Because a God who was born of a virgin, announced by stars, and resurrected after death is exponentially harder to replace than a God who was simply powerful. The template does not prove any of these stories false. It asks a harder question. Who wrote the original? From a story told across every civilization, we move now to the most specific act of political invention ever committed. A city, a date, a wolf that never existed, and an empire built on all three, the she-wolf that never existed. The greatest empire in Western history was built on a story about twin brothers raised by a wolf. Romulus killed Remus, drew a line in the dirt, and Rome was born. Every Roman child learned this. Every emperor invoked it. Every military campaign was justified by descent from the sacred bloodline that began on the Palatine Hill on the 21st of April, 753 years before the Common Era. That is a very specific date for a story about a wolf. And archaeologists have been digging on that hill for 150 years. They have found the real Rome. It does not match the story. It never did. The founding date of 753 before the Common Era was not discovered. It was calculated. The Roman scholar Marcus Terentius Varro worked it out in 37 before the Common Era, using a method of counting backwards through king lists, a technique that modern historians regard as approximately as reliable as reading horoscopes for historical precision. He was doing this 716 years after the supposed event, which is the chronological equivalent of someone today calculating the exact founding date of medieval Venice from memory, without documents, without archaeology, and without any corroborating evidence. The result is a number. It is not a date. What the archaeology on the Palatine Hill actually shows is continuous habitation stretching back to approximately 900 before the Common Era, with post-hole evidence and hut foundations that radiocarbon dating places across the 9th and 8th centuries. Christopher Smith's analysis in the Roman Clan, published in 2006, traces a gradual coalescence of Iron Age villages into a recognizable urban settlement. There was no founding moment. There was no single act of creation. Rome grew the way cities actually grow, slowly, messily, and without anyone recording it, because no one knew it would become Rome. The Romulus and Remus narrative first appears in complete form in the writings of Quintus Fabius Pictor, around 200 before the Common Era, which is over 500 years after the claimed events. There are no earlier textual records. There are no earlier inscriptions. There is no earlier evidence of the story's existence at all. It appears, fully formed, at the precise moment Rome is fighting the Punic Wars against Carthage and desperately needs a divine origin story to match the legitimacy of its Mediterranean rivals. And then it gets sharper. Augustus Caesar, consolidating power after the assassination of Julius Caesar and the civil wars that followed, simultaneously commissioned two of the greatest literary works in Roman history. Virgil's Aeneid, completed in 19 before the Common Era, traces the founding bloodline from the Trojan hero Aeneas directly to the Julian family and therefore to Augustus. Livy's History of Rome, begun in 27 before the Common Era, provides the full narrative of Romulus and Remus as established historical fact. Both works were produced under direct imperial patronage. Livy himself, with remarkable intellectual honesty in his preface, admitted that he could not verify events from Rome's earliest centuries. He wrote the history anyway. The Capitoline wolf, that famous bronze statue of the she-wolf suckling the twins, was dated for centuries to the 5th century before the Common Era, making it a near-contemporary artifact of the founding era. Then in 2006, Italian researchers conducted radiocarbon analysis of the bronze and found it was cast somewhere between the 11th and 12th centuries of the Common Era, more than 1,000 years after the events it supposedly commemorates. The twins Romulus and Remus were added to the sculpture even later, in the 15th century. The most iconic image of Rome's founding is a medieval fabrication with Renaissance additions. It worked too well. It looked too ancient, so nobody tested it. Even the name Roma has no confirmed Latin etymology, which is linguistically strange for a city at the center of the Latin world. The scholar Giulio Facchetti proposed an Etruscan origin, which would mean the city was named by a civilization the Romans later conquered, absorbed, and culturally erased. The Etruscans had their own account of Rome's early centuries. That account is almost entirely gone. The mainstream position is that the founding myth contains a kernel of historical truth, that there were real early kings, real early conflicts, real processes of urbanization that the story preserves in symbolic form. And that is probably true. But a kernel of truth wrapped in 7 centuries of political fabrication is not history. It is a tool. The story of Romulus was not written to record what happened. It was written to make what was happening seem inevitable, divine, ancient beyond question. When Augustus celebrated the 750th anniversary of the founding in 2 before the Common Era, he had just finished eliminating his last political rivals. The birthday party was also a coronation, and the wolf was the alibi. From a manufactured founding myth, we descend deeper into the machinery of power to the discovery that time itself was never a neutral measure. It was always a weapon, and the people who owned the calendar owned the world. The calendar was a weapon. The Maya could predict solar eclipses to within minutes using nothing but naked eye observation and a 365.2420-day calendar, a figure more accurate than the Julian calendar Europe would use for 1,500 years. Their astronomers tracked the synodic period of Venus across a 583.92-day cycle. They calculated it correctly to within 2/100ths of a day. These are not approximations. These are the results of centuries of systematic, meticulous observation recorded by a literate priestly class and stored in screenfold books that were never shared with the farmers who worked the fields below the temples. When the eclipse came and the priests had known it was coming for a year, the population did not know that. They felt the sky go dark and they were terrified, and the priest stepped forward. And the priest had the answer. You cannot buy that kind of authority. You can only inherit it from the people who built the system. The Sumerian sexagesimal calendar, codified around 2,400 years before the Common Era in the city of Ur, divided the year into 12 lunar months with intercalary months inserted by royal decree. This is the critical detail. The king alone could lengthen or shorten a year. A year with an extra month means debt repayment cycles are extended, meaning creditors wait longer. It means taxation dates shift, meaning the state collects when it chooses. It means festival obligations move, meaning religious attendance is controlled. The calendar tablets from the Ur-3 period, held in collections across Europe, document this royal calendar authority in dense administrative cuneiform. The king did not just rule the land, he ruled time itself, and time governed everything else. The Egyptian civil calendar of 365 days, established by approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era, was maintained in deliberate parallel with the Sothic cycle, which tracked the Nile flood through the heliacal rising of the star Sirius. These two calendars drifted apart by 1 day every 4 years, and they only realigned once every 1,460 years, an event the Egyptians called the Sothic cycle. The priests who could reconcile the two calendars, who knew when the flood was actually coming versus when the civil calendar said it should come, held knowledge that determined the difference between a harvest and a famine. No farmer could independently verify that knowledge. The observation had to be made from a temple roof by trained astronomers who had learned the method from the generation before. Anthony Aveni, in Sky Watchers of Ancient Mexico, published in 1980, traced how the Maya long count calendar functioned not just as an astronomical record, but as a political architecture. Linda Shaley and David Friedel, in A Forest of Kings from 1990, showed how Maya kings legitimized their reigns by positioning themselves at critical junctures in the long count, claiming their coronation coincided with cosmic turning points that had been prophesied centuries earlier. The calendar did not just record events, it authorized them. A king who ascended to power at the precise end of a calendrical cycle was not merely lucky. He was cosmically inevitable. The calendar said so. The priest confirmed it. The farmer believed it. The Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving Maya books, contains eclipse tables that correctly predicted eclipses across a 10,000-day cycle. It was burned, along with thousands of other Maya documents, by Bishop Diego de Landa in a single day in 1562. De Landa himself later wrote that he burned the books because they contained nothing but superstition and falsehood, and that the Maya wept bitterly at their destruction. He subsequently spent years trying to reconstruct Maya, writing from the fragments he had not yet destroyed. He burned the calendar and then wanted it back. That is how valuable it was. Julius Caesar's calendar reform of 46 before the Common Era required inserting 90 extra days into that single year, an intervention only Caesar could authorize. The historian Dennis Feeney, in Caesar's calendar published in 2007, analyzed the political consequences of that insertion. Caesar's military appointments were extended. His enemies' legal vulnerabilities were prolonged. Rome's tax collection windows expanded. A man who could add 3 months to a year could use time as a political instrument, and Caesar did exactly that. The mainstream argument is that all of this was organic. Agricultural societies needed coordination. The specialists who provided it acquired authority as a natural byproduct of technical expertise. There is no conspiracy in the observation that useful knowledge confers power. And that is true. But organic does not explain why, in every case, across Sumer, Egypt, and the Maya lowlands, the astronomical data was classified. It was stored in temples. It was not taught to commoners. And when outside powers arrived and began to understand it, the first thing they did every single time was burn the records. You do not burn a farming almanac. You burn a weapon. And from the temples that held time captive, we travel now to a hill in Turkey, and a war that the entire academy dismissed as fiction for 2,000 years, right up until someone found the battlefield still buried in the earth. Troy was real, and the lie was that it wasn't. For 2,000 years, the greatest war story ever told was filed under mythology. Scholars called it poetry. Teachers called it metaphor. The city of Troy, the wooden horse, the 10-year siege, the burning towers, the face that launched 1,000 ships. All of it, the Academy said, was invented by a blind poet and his overactive imagination. The Trojan War did not happen. There was no Troy. There was no war. And then a German businessman with no formal archaeological training took a shovel to a hill on the northwestern coast of Turkey in 1871. He was there because he had read Homer's geographic descriptions and believed them. Every professional classicist in Europe thought he was embarrassing himself. He found 9 cities stacked on top of each other, and in the 7th one, he found the war. Heinrich Schliemann began excavating Hisarlik based on nothing more academically respectable than a careful reading of the Iliad's landscape descriptions, which the classical establishment of his era considered about as historically useful as reading a fairy tale for directions. His methods were destructive. He blasted through upper levels with a zeal that modern archaeologists still wince at. But the fundamental discovery survived his methods. The site contained 9 distinct city layers, labeled Troy 1 through Troy 9, spanning approximately 3,000 years before the Common Era to 500 of the Common Era. 3,000 years of continuous occupation on a strategically positioned promontory overlooking the Dardanelles. This was not a village. This was a place the ancient world could not stop rebuilding. Troy 7a is the layer that keeps everyone up at night. Dated to approximately 1200 before the Common Era, it shows stratigraphic evidence that is difficult to interpret as anything other than violent destruction. Burned building remains. Skeletal remains left unburied inside the city walls, which does not happen in a planned abandonment. Bronze arrowheads and spearheads embedded in the fortification walls. A rapid, disorganized end to occupation with storage vessels left sealed and full, suggesting the inhabitants either fled or were killed before they could take their supplies. Carl Blegen's University of Cincinnati expedition, which excavated the site systematically from 1932 to 1938, documented all of this in careful stratigraphic detail in Troy and the Trojans, published in 1963. The walls themselves are a problem for the myth dismissal position. The fortifications of Troy, 6 and 7a were 4 to 5 meters thick and stood up to 9 meters high, enclosing an area of approximately 200,000 square meters. The palace complexes within were substantial. The infrastructure suggests a prosperous, well-defended city of regional importance. Homer describes exactly this. The Iliad's Troy is not a fantasy kingdom. It is a specific, wealthy, strategically located citadel, and the archaeological record at Hisarlik describes exactly that specific, wealthy, strategically located citadel. Then in the 20th century, researchers working through Hittite cuneiform archives at Bogazkoy, the ancient Hittite capital Hattusa, found something remarkable. References to a city called Wilusa and a ruler named Alexandru in diplomatic correspondence. The scholar Frank Stark published an analysis identifying Wilusa as the probable Hittite name for Troy and Alexandru as a Hittite rendering of Alexandros, which is the Trojan prince Paris's formal name in the Iliad. The Hittites, the dominant power of the ancient Near East, were writing letters about Troy and its king at the exact period Homer describes. External documentary corroboration for a story the Academy called fiction. Michael Ventress's decipherment of Linear B in 1952 confirmed that Mycenaean Greek civilization, Homer's Achaeans, had the administrative infrastructure for large-scale military operations. The palace tablets at Mycenae record weapons inventories, troop deployments, and naval logistics with the specificity of a military state preparing for exactly the kind of prolonged overseas campaign Homer describes. And recent dendrochronological evidence suggests a major earthquake around 1250 years before the Common Era weakened Troy 6, whose subsequent reconstruction as Troy 7a would have created a window of regional vulnerability, a newly destabilized power at the entrance to the Black Sea trade routes that every Aegean kingdom depended on. The mainstream position now, articulated by scholars including Sarah Morris, is that the Iliad preserves genuine historical memory of a Bronze Age conflict. That is the mainstream position today. It was not the mainstream position in 1870. The reversal was forced by a man with a shovel and a belief in a story that 2,000 years of scholars had dismissed, which raises a question that the reversal itself demands. If the Academy was wrong about Troy for 2 millennia, what else is it currently wrong about? What other wars, what other cities, what other civilizations are embedded in stories we have decided to call myths? How many more Troys are still under hills we have not dug yet? From a war buried under academic contempt, we climb to something higher, to the machinery that made every king in history untouchable. Not a weapon, not a wall, a story. And the story was always the same story, the divine right of kings. Here is the most successful lie in human history. It was told for 5,000 years on 6 continents. It convinced billions of people to surrender their food, their labor, their children, and their lives to a single human being seated at the top of a pyramid. And the lie was always identical. This person is not merely human. He was chosen by the gods. He descends from the sun. He is the living axis of cosmic order, and without him, the sky will fall. The staggering part is not that they invented it. Humans invent all kinds of things in desperation. The staggering part is that it worked, everywhere, every time, for 5,000 years, and the lie left fingerprints. The Narmer palette is the oldest historical record of Egyptian unification, dated to approximately 3,100 years before the Common Era. It is a carved ceremonial object depicting the pharaoh Narmer wearing the double crown and striking down an enemy. Above him, directly framing his act of violence, is the falcon god Horus. The visual grammar is explicit. The king acts, the god authorizes. Political authority and divine sanction are not two separate claims. They are the same claim, pressed into the same object from the first moment Egypt became Egypt. The scholar Henry Frankfurt spent his career tracing this mechanism in Kingship and the Gods, published in 1948, documenting how Egyptian theology did not describe the pharaoh as God's representative. It described him as the God himself, incarnated in flesh to maintain the order of the cosmos. In Mesopotamia, the Akkadian concept of Malamu described a supernatural radiance that literally surrounded kings and gods. Texts from the Akkadian Empire, dating to 2,300 years before the Common Era, describe Sargon of Akkad as clothed in divine light that caused enemies to flee not from his armies, but from his presence alone. This is not metaphor in the text. It is presented as physical fact, as a biological reality of kingship. You did not merely obey Sargon because he had soldiers. You obeyed Sargon because the alternative was to stand in the presence of a walking God and refuse him. The social technology of divine radiance converts political authority into something closer to a law of nature. Cross the Atlantic and the architecture is identical. In Aztec theology, as documented by the Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún in his Florentine Codex in 1569, the Tlatoani, the speaker king, was not a ruler who happened to be religiously favored. He was the living representative of Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, on earth. The tribute economy of the Aztec Empire, the human sacrifice at its pyramids, the vast machinery of extraction that fed Tenochtitlan was not politics, it was cosmic maintenance. Without the king's rituals, the sun would not rise. Without the blood offerings, time itself would stop. The population had no way to independently verify whether this was true. The priests knew. The king knew. And the morning always came, which seemed to confirm everything. Louis XIV of France, reigning from 1643 to 1715, had the ceiling of the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles painted with his own likeness as Apollo, the sun god. He called himself the Sun King. He centralized all political power in his own body with the famous formulation that he was the state itself. He was doing this 4,700 years after the first Egyptian pharaoh made the same solar identification in a completely different cultural tradition with no knowledge of the Narmer palette. The researcher, Peter Turchin, and colleagues analyzing 414 societies over 10,000 years in a study published in 2019, found that the adoption of supernatural punishment beliefs consistently preceded the emergence of large, complex societies, not the reverse. The gods who punish human wrongdoing appear first. The large civilization follows. Divine authority is not a byproduct of complexity. It is, apparently, one of its causes. The mainstream explanation is that this was functional. Ara Norenzian argued in Big Gods, published in 2013, that moralizing supernatural beliefs solve the cooperation problem in large societies by creating a universal enforcer who monitors behavior beyond the reach of human authority. And that is a genuinely powerful framework. It explains why divine kingship keeps appearing. It does not explain why it always looks so similar. The solar identification, the celestial crown, the iconography of superhuman scale. These specific visual and theological choices appear in Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Americas, China, and 17th century France. Functional tools explain the existence of the pattern. They do not explain its consistency. What if divine kingship was not independently invented but transmitted? Through the same channels that transmitted the flood myth, the pyramid, the calendar? And if it was transmitted somewhere at the beginning of the transmission chain, someone wrote the manual. Someone decided that the most effective way to rule was to make yourself indistinguishable from the sky. We have found the fingerprints of that decision on every continent. we have not yet found the hand. From the king who claims to be the son, we descend to something even more intimate. The story that told you not just who your ruler was, but who you were. From the moment you were born, before you had a chance to argue, the caste system was written by the ruling class. Imagine you are born into a family that cleans the dead, not because of circumstances, not because of poverty or misfortune, because when God created the universe, He made your ancestors from the dust beneath His foot. The priests were made from His mouth, the warriors from His arms, the merchants from His thighs, and your people, your family, your children, and your children's children were made from the lowest part of the lowest thing. This is not a political decision. This is the shape of reality itself. It was ordained before the first stone was laid, before the first word was spoken, before time began. And someone wrote it down. Someone had the extraordinary audacity to write it down and then to claim that the text was divine. The Purusha Sukta is the 10th book, 90th hymn of the Rig Veda, the foundational sacred text of the Vedic tradition. It describes the 4 social varnas emerging from the sacrificed body of a primordial cosmic giant named Purusha. Brahmins, the priestly class, came from his mouth. Kshatriyas, the warrior rulers, from his arms. Vaishyas, the merchants, from his thighs. Shudras, the laboring class, from his feet. This is not presented in the text as a social observation or a political recommendation. It is presented as cosmological history, as a description of what happened at the moment of creation, before which no argument is possible. The caste system does not merely have legal authority, it has the authority of the universe's own structure. The historian Ramala Thapar in early India, published in 2002, placed the Purusha Sukta among the later additions to the Rig Veda, composed not during the earliest Vedic period, but during a subsequent era of increasing Brahmanic institutional consolidation. Textual analysis of the hymn's language, vocabulary, and metrical patterns is consistent with this later dating, which means the cosmic origin story was written after the social system it legitimized was already in place. The hierarchy came first. The divine sanction was composed to explain it and then retroactively inserted into the sacred canon at a point of sufficient authority that questioning the hierarchy became equivalent to questioning the cosmos. Patrick Olivell's critical edition of the Manusmriti, published in 2005, traces a similar pattern. The Manusmriti, the laws of Manu, codifies hundreds of specific caste regulations with explicit divine mandate. Its framing presents the entire legal code as a primordial revelation, but Olivell's philological analysis shows that the divine revelation framing was a later editorial addition layered over earlier, more pragmatic legal texts. The law came first. The claim that God spoke the law came after. It was added because laws can be debated, but divine revelation cannot. The Egyptian parallel is equally precise. The Memphite theology, inscribed on the Shabaka stone around 700 years before the Common Era, but claiming to copy a text from the Old Kingdom period thousands of years earlier, describes the god Ptah establishing social hierarchy through divine speech at the moment of creation. The antiquity claim is the point. An ancient text is harder to argue with than a recent one. John Wilson's analysis in The Culture of Ancient Egypt documented how the claim of ancient origin was itself a political instrument. And in Aztec cosmology, as recorded in the legend of the 5 suns, the current world was created specifically through the sacrifice of noble beings. Their blood debt to the gods required the permanent subordination of the commoner class to the warrior priest elite. The hierarchy was not just ordained. It was the price of the sun continuing to rise. The Dalit population of India, the group historically designated as outside and beneath the four Varna system, currently numbers approximately 200 million people. A 2009 genetic study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics by Reich and colleagues found that Indian caste groups show genetic differentiation consistent with endogamy, caste-based marriage restrictions dating back approximately 1500 to 2000 years. The biological consequences of the social system map almost exactly onto the period of the Manusmritis codification. The law became biology, the text became DNA. The mainstream response is that all complex societies require legitimization narratives, that the caste systems serve genuine organizational functions in large agrarian societies, and that it has been contested and modified throughout its history. All of that is true. But there is a specific feature of the Purusha Sukta that goes beyond ordinary legitimization. When you write the hierarchy into the body of the Creator God, you do not merely justify the present arrangement. You remove it from the domain of politics entirely. It becomes a question of physics. And the people who wrote it into the God's body were the people who occupied the God's mouth. That is not a coincidence. That is a confession written in the language of the sacred. From the lie that told you who you were born to be, we cross the Mediterranean and travel east to a story that told an entire people who their God chose them above all others, and built the most enduring territorial claim in human history on a text that may have been written by the people who needed the claim. The chosen people. The Exodus is one of the most powerful stories ever told. Millions of enslaved people, miraculously liberated from the greatest empire in the world, led across a desert by a God who spoke from fire, who parted the sea, who wrote his laws on stone, and handed them to a prophet on a mountain. It is the foundational narrative of three major world religions. It has shaped more law, more politics, more geography, and more violence than almost any story in human history. And in 1999, the Israeli archaeologist Ze'ev Herzog, one of Israel's most prominent and respected scholars, published a summary of his life's work in the newspaper Haaretz. His conclusion, stated plainly, was that the Exodus, as described in the Hebrew Bible, almost certainly did not happen. His university received death threats. He did not retract a word. The problem is not theological. The problem is empirical. Egyptian records from the New Kingdom period, roughly 1500 to 1070 years before the Common Era, are among the most detailed administrative archives the ancient world produced. They document grain rations for foreign workers, inventories of Semitic laborers, diplomatic marriages, military campaigns, and religious festivals with the specificity of a modern bureaucracy. Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, in The Bible Unearthed published in 2001, synthesized decades of Israeli and Egyptian archaeological research to make a point that is difficult to argue with. If 2 to 3 million people left Egypt in a single event, if the plagues described in Exodus actually struck the most powerful civilization in the ancient world, if a nation wandered the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, there would be evidence. Egyptian records would mention it. The Sinai, one of the most archaeologically surveyed desert regions on Earth, would contain material traces of that wandering population. There is nothing. The city of Jericho, whose walls famously fell to Joshua's trumpets in the conquest narrative that follows the Exodus, was excavated by the archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon in the 1950s. She found that Jericho had no walls during the Late Bronze Age period corresponding to the conquest narrative and may have been unoccupied entirely during the relevant centuries. The walls did not fall. The archaeological record suggests there were no walls to fall. And then there is the book of Deuteronomy itself, which contains the most explicit articulation of the chosen people covenant. According to the second book of Kings, Deuteronomy was discovered hidden in the temple by priests during the reign of King Josiah in 621 years before the Common Era. It was not merely found, it was found at the precise moment Josiah was engaged in the most aggressive political centralization program in Judahite history, destroying rival shrines throughout the kingdom and consolidating all worship in Jerusalem, which he controlled. The biblical scholar Richard Elliott Friedman, in Who Wrote the Bible, published in 1987, argued that Deuteronomy was composed, not discovered, and that its theology, with its insistence on one God, one temple, and one chosen people, was perfectly designed to serve Josiah's political agenda. The document that authorized the agenda was found at exactly the moment the agenda needed authorization. A 2010 genetic study by Bihar and colleagues in the American Journal of Human Genetics found that while Jewish populations worldwide show evidence of a Middle Eastern ancestral component, the genetic picture is consistent with multiple origins and significant admixture over centuries, rather than descent from a single founding population following a specific Exodus event. Finkelstein and Silberman's analysis of early Israelite pottery and settlement patterns at highland sites in Canaan suggests that the earliest Israelites were not immigrant conquerors arriving from Egypt, but indigenous Canaanite pastoral communities who gradually developed a distinct cultural identity, which means the people defined by their separation from Canaan may have been Canaanites all along. The mainstream theological response is that none of this invalidates the religious and cultural significance of the Exodus tradition, that origin stories need not be literally historical to be spiritually true, and that most mainstream theologians understand the chosen people covenant as a relationship rather than a racial claim. That is a reasonable position. But the political consequences of the literal reading are not theological. They are territorial, legal, military. The doctrine of discovery, issued as a papal bull by Pope Alexander VI in 1493, cited the same theological framework to grant European powers dominion over non-Christian lands. The Vatican only formally repudiated it in March of 2023. That is 530 years during which a story of divine selection functioned as operating international law. What if Josiah's priests wrote the covenant and then buried it in the temple so they could find it? What if the chosen people framework was the ancient world's most successful political manifesto, written in the voice of God and retroactively inserted into an origin story old enough to be beyond challenge? We may never know with certainty, but we should be honest about what the archaeological record does and does not contain, and what it does not contain after a century of the most intensive archaeological surveying ever applied to any region in history is the Exodus. From a territory defined by a disputed divine claim, we cross the world's largest ocean to a small island and a story about self-destruction that was told not by the people who lived there, but about them. Easter Island did not commit suicide. You have heard the story. A small island in the Pacific, roughly 2,300 kilometers from the nearest inhabited land. A sophisticated civilization, remarkable engineering. Hundreds of enormous stone heads called moai, some standing over 10 meters high, weighing up to 80 tons, moved and erected without metal tools or wheeled transport. And then collapse. Total, catastrophic, self-inflicted collapse. The people cut down every single tree on the island to move their statues. When the last tree fell, the ecosystem failed, the population crashed, and the civilization died by its own hand. It is one of the most repeated cautionary tales of the modern era. Jared Diamond devoted a chapter to it in his 2005 bestseller Collapse, and that chapter has been assigned in university courses around the world for 20 years. It is also, according to the most recent evidence, substantially wrong. And the story that replaced it does not make for comfortable reading in Western classrooms. The ecocide narrative rests on specific demographic claims. It requires a pre-collapse population of roughly 15,000 to 20,000 people, a massive deforestation event driven by statue construction, and a subsequent population crash to roughly 2,000 to 3,000 before European contact in 1722. The Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen, who arrived on Easter Sunday of that year and gave the island its European name, described a population he estimated at 2,000 to 3,000 people. His records note organized social structure, functioning agriculture, and no signs of widespread famine or conflict. The collapse, according to the ecocide narrative, had already happened, but his description does not read like a post-apocalyptic civilization. It reads like a small, functioning one. In 2023, a study published in Nature with a team that included researchers Anna Gosling and Katrine Jarman analyzed ancient DNA from 15 pre-contact Rapa Nui individuals. The genetic data showed diversity consistent with a stable, healthy population with no bottleneck signatures that would indicate a catastrophic crash before European arrival. The population did not collapse before Roggeveen's ships appeared on the horizon. It was intact. The collapse came after. Peruvian slave ships conducted a series of raids on Rapa Nui beginning in 1862, capturing and transporting approximately 1,500 people, roughly half the island's estimated population at the time, to work in Peruvian guano mines. This event is documented in Peruvian court records and in contemporary accounts. International pressure eventually forced Peru to repatriate the survivors. Of the few who survived the mines and the journey back, almost all died at sea or on arrival from tuberculosis and smallpox. The disease then spread through the remaining island population. By 1877, 111 people remained alive on Rapa Nui. Not the remnants of a civilization that had destroyed itself, the survivors of a civilization that had been destroyed by other people. Carl Lipo and Terry Hunt's experimental archaeology, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science in 2012, demonstrated that the moai could be walked upright using ropes and a rocking motion, requiring no timber infrastructure. The trees were not cut down to move the statues. The deforestation of Rapa Nui's palm forests, documented in palynological analysis by the same researchers, was real, but the population adapted through lithic mulch agriculture, using rocks to retain soil moisture and remain productive without tree cover. The moai were still being carved at the moment of European contact, which is not the behavior of a civilization in its death throes. It is the behavior of a civilization still very much alive. The population peak figures that the ecocide story requires, the 15,000 to 20,000 that supposedly collapsed to 2,000, were based on estimates that have since been substantially revised downward. The revised figures suggest the island may never have held a population large enough for the catastrophic crash the narrative requires. The numbers that built the story were wrong. The story built on those numbers became global curriculum. What the ecocide narrative does is convert an act of colonial destruction into a story about indigenous failure. It takes the Rapa Nui people, who survived in isolation for centuries in one of the most remote locations on Earth, and built one of the most extraordinary monumental traditions in human history, and it makes them the authors of their own extinction. The actual authors of their near extinction, the Peruvian slave traders, and the diseases that followed them, are not in Jared Diamond's chapter. They appear in footnotes, if at all. Who benefits from a world where the cautionary tale about civilizational collapse blames the civilization that was colonized rather than the one that did the colonizing? That is not a conspiracy question. It is a question about which stories get told, and in what form, and by whom, and for what audience? The answer in this case is clear enough that it does not require a theory. It requires only a date. The slave raids were 1862. The ecocide narrative was constructed in the 20th century. The records were available the entire time. And now we arrive at the final item, the largest lie, the one that was not told to a single civilization, but to an entire hemisphere. A lie so large it required a pope, a legal doctrine, and the deliberate erasure of 60 million people from the map. The discovery of America. On the 12th of October, 1492, Christopher Columbus stood on a beach in what is now the Bahamas and claimed to have discovered a new world. There were people on that beach. There had been people on that beach for at least 15,000 years. There were cities in the Americas larger than any city in Europe. Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, held a population of 200,000 to 300,000 people, 5 times the size of London at the same period. The Amazon was not a pristine wilderness, but a managed, densely settled landscape feeding millions. The Mississippi cultures of North America had built earthwork mounds visible from kilometers away. The Inca had constructed a road system extending over 40,000 kilometers across some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. Columbus did not discover a new world. He discovered someone else's world. And the story built on that discovery was not history. It was the founding legal fiction of the modern era, and it is still producing legal consequences today. 492 years before Columbus, Leif Erikson established a Norse settlement at what is now L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland. This is not a theory. The settlement was excavated beginning in 1960 by Helgi and Ann Steen Ingstad. It contains Norse-style buildings, a Norse bronze pin, and evidence of iron smelting, which indigenous North American cultures did not practice. In 2021, a study published in Nature used the presence of a precisely dated cosmic ray event in tree rings to pinpoint the occupation to exactly the year 1021 of the Common Era. That is a date, not a range. Norse Europeans were in North America 492 years before the voyage that supposedly discovered it. 290 years before Columbus, genetic evidence now suggests Polynesian navigators made contact with indigenous people in what is now Colombia. A 2020 study in Nature by Ioannidis Blanco Portillo and colleagues analyzing genomic data from 807 individuals across 17 Polynesian and 15 Native American populations found definitive evidence of admixture dating to approximately 1200 of the Common Era. The Polynesian navigators, who crossed the Pacific in open double-hulled canoes using only star navigation and wave reading, reached the Americas, made sustained contact with indigenous communities, and left a genetic trace that the most advanced genomic analysis in history has now confirmed. They did this without compasses, without maps, and approximately 3 centuries before Columbus sailed a well-funded expedition along a known route to an already inhabited world. Pre-contact population estimates for the Americas have been revised upward dramatically in recent decades. William Denovan's edited volume, The Native Population of the Americas in 1492, published in 1992, placed the figure at approximately 54 million. Henry Dobbins had proposed figures as high as 90 to 112 million in his landmark 1966 paper in Current Anthropology. By 1650, the population had fallen to approximately 6 million, a reduction of somewhere between 80 and 95% in under 2 centuries, driven primarily by introduced disease, and in some cases, as documented in a 1763 letter from the British officer Lord Geoffrey Amherst, by deliberate biological strategy. The legal architecture that made all of this possible was the doctrine of discovery. On the 4th of May, 1493, Pope Alexander VI issued the papal bull Inter Caetera, granting Spain dominion over all lands discovered to the west and instructing that barbarous nations be subjugated and brought to the faith. This document did not merely bless Columbus's voyage after the fact. It established a legal principle that non-Christian territories were available for appropriation by Christian powers regardless of existing population, sovereignty, or title. That principle was incorporated into American law by the Supreme Court in an 1823 ruling authored by Chief Justice John Marshall, which established that indigenous peoples could occupy land but not hold legal title to it, because title had passed to European discoverers under the doctrine of discovery. The Vatican formally repudiated the doctrine of discovery in March of 2023, not in 1494, not in 1776, not in 1865. 2023. That is 530 years during which a theological lie about an empty continent functioned as the legal foundation of the hemisphere's property law. Columbus did not discover America. He discovered it for the legal and theological framework that needed it discovered. The 60 million people already there were not an obstacle to the discovery. They were an inconvenience to the story. And the story, not the obstacle, is what survived. 10 lies, 10 civilizations, and when you step back and look at all of them together, the pattern that emerges is not chaos, it is not coincidence, it is architecture. The Library of Alexandria was not burned in one night. It was dismantled across 7 centuries by every regime that understood that a people with access to their own intellectual history are significantly harder to rule than a people without one. The virgin birth template was not divine revelation. It was a political operating system installed in state religion after state religion because a God-descended ruler is structurally harder to depose than a merely human one. Rome's founding myth, the Trojan War dismissed as fiction, the calendar classified and locked in temples, the divine right embedded in sun imagery, the caste system written into the body of the Creator God, the Exodus inscribed as legal title, Easter Island's people blamed for their own destruction, Columbus given credit for a continent already mapped by Polynesian navigators, Norse explorers, and 15,000 years of human settlement. Every single one of these is the same move, an act of human political decision embedded in the language of the eternal, the cosmic, the natural, and the divine. The mainstream response to this pattern is consistent across all 10. These were functional narratives. Complex societies require origin stories. Hierarchies need legitimization. Knowledge has always been power, and none of that is wrong. These stories did hold civilizations together. They did coordinate millions of people across centuries. The calendar worked. The founding myths inspired real loyalty. The divine king commanded real armies that won real battles. By one measure, these lies were the most effective tools ever devised. But they worked for whom? That is the question history consistently declines to answer in full. In every case, across all 10 items, the narrative that was embedded in cosmic language, the story declared too ancient to question and too sacred to challenge, concentrated authority at the top of a hierarchy and asked everyone below to accept their position as the natural order of the universe. The priests own time. The king owns heaven. Your caste was settled before you were born. Your land was empty before we arrived. It is the same lie, told in 10 different languages, across 5,000 years of recorded history. And the people who wrote it were always, without exception, the people who benefited from it. Most people walk through museums, read the plaques, accept the timeline, and move on. The story is tidy. The dates are certain. The experts have spoken. But you made it through all 10 items. You did not look away when the evidence became uncomfortable. You stayed with the questions even when the answers were not clean. That means your brain is not wired for comfort. It is wired for questions. This channel exists for exactly that kind of mind, for people who understand that the most important question in the study of history is not what happened. It is who decided what you were allowed to know about it. Hit subscribe. We are just getting started. Every civilization leaves two things behind: the stones it built, and the story it told about why it built them. The stones can be excavated. The story can be questioned. But only if someone is willing to ask whether the people who told the story were the same people who built the wall, wore the crown, and burned the books. The lie does not end when the civilization does. It survives in the legal documents, the textbooks, the borders, the silent spaces where the other stories used to be. We began with a library that was never burned in a single night. We end with a continent that was never empty. Someone decided what you were allowed to know. Decide for yourself what to do with that. Subscribe if you want to keep asking.